Hello, class. I'm here today to talk to you about a couple of the topics that are in the chapter on biological psychology. Those two topics are the peripheral nervous system, and we'll talk briefly about genetic influences on psychological variables. So let's first start talking about the peripheral nervous system. As you can see here in this slide, humans have a nervous system that is divided into two different systems. There's the central nervous system, which includes what's orange here, the brain and the spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is all the neurons that sort of emanate from the spinal cord and also cranial nerves in the face that go up into the brain and innervate the rest of the body. And the peripheral nervous system is actually divided further into two separate systems. There's what we call the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Again, they're just two different parts of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system includes those neurons in the peripheral nervous system that process information from your senses, like your eyes, visual information, your ears, auditory information, your skin, your sensation of touch. And then also it monitors information to and from your skeletal muscles, which helps to keep you upright, help you move, help you pick up objects, turn your head and smile and so forth. Then there's the autonomic nervous system. This is the neurons in the peripheral nervous system that control involuntary muscles, organs, and glands like your heart, your lungs, your liver, your intestines, and so forth. And I always think in this chapter, it's really helpful to show pictures. So this picture is a visual representation of the somatic nervous system. You can see the neurons coming out of the spinal cord that are innervating the body and therefore allowing you to feel all of your senses and to move and to feel your muscles. And then the autonomic nervous system here, you can see the neurons coming from your spinal cord that innervate your glands and involuntary muscles, like again, your lungs, your heart, your gallbladder, adrenal gland, kidneys, and so forth. And as a little rule of thumb, I like to think, I'm going to go back a slide, I like to think of the somatic nervous system as the neurons in the peripheral part of the nervous system that keep you aware of your environment and allow you to move through your environment, whereas the neurons in the autonomic nervous system are more survival oriented in that they're just doing the bare bones things to keep you alive by keeping the internal parts of your body working. Now, I know this can be confusing, so we have the nervous system, it's divided into two separate systems, the central and the peripheral nervous system. Then the peripheral nervous system is further divided into the autonomic and somatic systems. And then the autonomic nervous system is further divided into two more systems. One is the sympathetic nervous system, the other is the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is what prepares your organs for rigorous activity, and when it's active, you'll feel psychological arousal or alertness and energy. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. It slows down your body and it's involved in the psychological experience of relaxation. Okay. And a lot of times when you're first learning about these two systems, it can be easy to sort of oversimplify it and think, okay, sometimes the sympathetic nervous system is on while the parasympathetic nervous system is off. And other times the parasympathetic nervous system is on while the sympathetic nervous system is off. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification. In reality, the truth is both systems are always on, so to speak, but at different times, they sort of, one is more active than the other, right? So let's use your heart as an example. If your sympathetic nervous system is more active in a given moment than your parasympathetic nervous system, then your heart is receiving more norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system than it is receiving acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nervous system. Norepinephrine and acetylcholine are neurotransmitters. So if it's receiving more norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system in a given moment, then it's going to beat really fast. On the other hand, 10 minutes later, the level of norepinephrine it's getting slows down from the sympathetic nervous system, and then the parasympathetic nervous system may start releasing more acetylcholine, and that then will slow down your heart rate. So these two systems are constantly sort of changing their level of activity and sort of taking turns in which one is more active. And you see here, whenever the sympathetic nervous system is more active, all of the different things you'd expect, your pupils will dilate, your heartbeat will accelerate, your digestion will slow down, and so forth. Whereas when your parasympathetic nervous system is more active, you would expect pupils to be contracted, the heart rate to slow down, your digestion to stimulate, and so forth. So on Thanksgiving, just after you've finished eating a huge lunch or dinner, probably the parasympathetic nervous system is more active. On the other hand, if you're walking through a forest and you see a bear, then immediately your sympathetic nervous system is going to become more active than your parasympathetic nervous system, and that's going to allow you to get away from the bear. And also keep in mind the sympathetic nervous system is sort of synonymous with the fight or flight response that you've probably heard of. Now, little research in psychology focuses on the peripheral nervous system. Medical disciplines certainly focus on the peripheral nervous system, but the psychology, it's not all that relevant. Historically, there was a period of time where researchers studied the autonomic nervous system in order to understand its relation to arousal and ultimately to understand how it affects our emotional experiences. And basically, they would hook people up to these instruments where they could measure your heart rate, your perspiration, they'd look at your pupils and so forth, and they'd expose you to different types of films, ones that were supposed to elicit anger, ones that were supposed to elicit sexual arousal, ones that are supposed to make you bored, and so forth. And they were hoping that they would find different patterns of activity for different types of emotional experiences that people were having, so that they could then say, okay, when people are feeling angry, these are the patterns of activity we see in their sympathetic nervous system, which is different than this other pattern of activity when a person is experiencing this other emotion. But psychologists were surprised to learn that really there were only two general patterns of activity that were observed. One were patterns of activity that underlied arousing emotions like fear, anger, sexual arousal, and so forth, excitement. And then, which would be increased heart rate, perspiration, dilated pupils. And then, on the other hand, there was a different pattern of activity that people demonstrated when they had low arousal emotions like boredom, peace, relaxation, and so forth, which would be the opposite of what you see here. Contracted pupils, lessened perspiration, lower heart rate, and so forth. So, because there wasn't a whole lot of success studying the sympathetic nervous system in relation to emotion, or at least there wasn't a whole lot of specificity that could be found, more recently they've focused on how the brain is active or has different patterns of activity depending on which emotion a person is feeling. And some of the things they've found, for example, are that the amygdala seems to play a bigger role in the experience of fear than anger. So the amygdala is strongly associated with the experience of fear. The right prefrontal cortex seems to play a larger role when we experience disgust than the left side of the prefrontal cortex. And another example is how the anterior cingulate cortex seems to play a larger role in our experience of empathy compared to other parts of the brain. So these kinds of findings here are what you're more likely to read about if you read about current information on how the nervous system is involved in emotion. All right, so moving beyond the peripheral nervous system and on to the genetic influences on behavior. Now keep in mind that biological psychologists are interested in genes because we know that genes affect physical traits like hair color, eye color, skin color, and so forth. And so it stands to reason that genes could also affect psychological attributes like your level of shyness. Are you shy or outgoing? Or your likelihood of developing a psychological disorder such as schizophrenia. And so just a quick little reminder of what genes are. The nucleus of every cell in your body contains chromosomes. So here's a nucleus. Here are the chromosomes inside the nucleus. And if you really zoom in on the chromosomes, you'll find that they're made of DNA structures or DNA molecules and tiny segments of DNA that control various traits are considered genes. Now, psychologists are not geneticists, and that can make it very tricky to study genes for psychologists because we don't know how to take a sample of blood and unravel your DNA to decide which of your genes affects which of your psychological attributes. So instead, psychologists are stuck studying heritability, which is a very indirect way of studying genetic influences. Heritability refers to how much a behavior is influenced by genetic differences between people. So there's two different types of heritability studies. There's twin studies, and then there's adoption studies. Twin studies use the logic that if a psychological trait is genetically influenced, then identical twins should be more similar on that psychological trait than fraternal twins. And that is because identical twins theoretically have 100% identical genes, whereas fraternal twins, which are twins that are born at the same time, but they don't look the same, they can be different sex, one can be a boy and one can be a girl, they only share about 50% of their genes, which is the same amount of genes that any other sibling who are born at separate times share. So if you find that identical twins are more similar on a trait than fraternal twins, it's believed that to some extent that is because the trait in question is influenced by the genes, and the reason why the identical twins are more similar is because they share more of their genes than fraternal twins do. So for example, they've done studies where they test the IQ of identical twins and fraternal twins. And what they find is identical twins have more similar IQ scores than fraternal twins, which suggests that IQ is to some extent not determined, but influenced by our genes. And a wide variety of psychological disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are strongly influenced by genes because what we have found is that identical twins are both more likely to be diagnosed with a disorder than fraternal twins. Now, another type of study that can be done to study heritability are adoption studies. And the way that adoption studies work is there's a logic behind them. They look at adopted kids and they measure them on a psychological trait like intelligence, psychological disorders, etc. And then they look at both the adoptive parents and the biological parents of those adopted kids. Now, these are adopted kids who've never met their biological parents. And the question is, are the adopted kids more like their biological parents whom they've never met, or are they more similar to their adoptive parents on that particular trait? And again, what research typically finds is that adopted kids tend to be more like their biological parents than their adoptive parents on a variety of traits such as IQ, psychological disorders, a variety of personality traits like shyness, conscientiousness, openness to new experiences, and so forth. Some of the very few things that adopted kids aren't more similar to their biological parents on. In other words, adopted kids are more similar to their adoptive parents rather than their biological parents, are on things like attitudes and values, manners and beliefs, and faith and politics. So, for example, an adopted child who thinks that education is important is more likely to have adopted parents who share that same belief rather than biological parents that share that same belief. And let's say an adopted kid has biological parents who are Republican and adopted parents who are Democrats, then adopted kids are more likely to share the Democratic views with their adoptive parents than with their biological parents. So what this suggests is that attitudes, values, manners, belief, faith, and politics, these particular things are less influenced by genes and maybe more influenced by the environment, or said another way, the adopted parents. Now, one thing I want to make sure I point out is that I'm not trying to say here that genes determine with absolute certainty anything about a person psychologically. The take-home message from heritability research in psychology is basically that most, not all, but most psychological attributes that you can think of do have a genetic influence that's stronger or weaker. For example, generalized anxiety disorder, there's a mild to moderate genetic influence on the development of that disorder. However, bipolar disorder has a strong genetic influence. So again, nothing is completely determined by your genes, but your genes can influence various psychological attributes. Now, in order to really make sure that this is making sense to you, I strongly encourage you to copy this link right here from the lecture notes, the attachment with the screencast, and paste it in your URL and watch it. It's going to talk about genetic influences on medical issues, but if you substitute whatever medical issue they're talking about with a psychological attribute like shyness, conscientiousness, or whatever makes most sense to you, you'll slowly start to see how genetic influences are really, really complicated. And as we learn more about them, they become more and more difficult to explain. All right, that's it for this screencast. Please email me if you have any questions.